So now we're on to secretions in the gastrointestinal tract, and then after this there is only a very short liver chapter, so we are getting towards the end of the alimentary canal. So for this topic we will first be discussing the secretions of each part of the tract. So we've gone through the different movements in each part, and the secretions in each area are going to align very closely with the functionality of that part. So if we're in the esophagus, the secretions have to do with movement. So it's going to be mainly mucus. In the stomach, we have chemical digestion. So we're also going to have to protect it. So each area is going to make specialized products to help it engage in whatever the digestive activity is. Those secretory products have a stimulus. Sometimes they are just the presence of food, other times they are chemical stimuli, so we'll go through that. And when we get to each product, you do have to know them, not just for the exam, but for your boards, you are required to know what the specific enzymes are, and catalytic enzymes, any kind of enzymes, what their functionality is, and then what makes them. Okay. And I'm going to talk about briefly some of the disorders that are involved with abnormalities of secretions of these products. So if I do mention them, I will ask questions about them. Okay, so there is a general term called juices, and you'll hear like gastric juices, pancreatic juices, and all of these are secretory products of the gastrointestinal tract. And the body is constantly making a pretty large volume, almost 7,000 milliliters of juices per day. I've mentioned in other lectures that some things have a pretty stable pH, and you can see the pHs here. Those numbers do have a range around them. We call that a confidence interval. But generally, if you know the pHs of things, they shouldn't change that much. And if there's abnormalities of those pHs, that's going to cause a bit of functionality issues. Saliva, we said, is a very basic pH. It's also very stable pH, which means drugs given by mouth are broken down sublingually or buccally pretty readily and predictably. Gastric secretion, there's about 1,500 mils, and about 1 to 3.5, that's your normal amount of pH in the stomach. So this is a very low pH environment. And then the next place that the contents will go after the stomach is to the duodenum. And the pancreas is there, which releases its products along with bile coming from the liver. But you'll notice that the pancreatic secretions, the pancreatic juices, have a very high pH. So it's very important that the pancreas squirt or secrete its bicarbonate, especially into the duodenum, to help to neutralize that really low pH environment of fluid coming from the stomach. Otherwise, you'll get duodenal ulcers, which you will see in cases where the pancreas is inhibited. Bile is the product of the liver, which is stored also in the gallbladder. However, if the gallbladder is removed, there is a duct coming from the liver called the common bile duct, and that duct can hold bile. You'll see that the main function of bile is to break down fats so that the products of fats can be absorbed and utilized by the body. They're also important in the actual excretion of fats. So if there's an abnormality with bile production or there's removal of the gallbladder, we call that a cholecystectomy, gallbladder removal, then you'll have lower amounts of bile because the gallbladder won't be there to store it. The small intestines, they secrete a large amount of products like mucus and also water coming from cells, and you'll see some other products like CCK. There's something called GLP, which help to manage satiety and also help with motility. And then in the large intestine, there's general secretions. There's a specialized gland called Brunner's glands with a very alkaline, high pH mucus, and general large intestinal secretions like mucus to help with fecal adherence and with motility through the tract. So the only place you have a really low pH is in the stomach, and that's going to be protected by the thick mucosal barrier there. So just starting out, secretion in the tract, we're going through each of these different areas that I just mentioned. Again, the functionality of that area will be what is not only determined by, but also helped by these secretory products. So we have chemical digestion and mechanical digestion. So the digestive enzymes are things that are made in most parts of the GI tract, and digestive enzymes shouldn't be produced unless there's food in that area. Otherwise, we start to digest parts of the body. So it's a very specific amount. It's specific to the type of food ingested, whether it's high in protein, fat, what have you, and it's a very exact process. Every single piece of the GI tract will be making mucus, because still at the end of the day, this is a canal, and the lumen inside of it needs to transport food all the way through a bolus to chyme to the fecal products that are then excreted by the body. So mucus is present everywhere, and it's a very important thing that is produced by the GI tract, in addition to other parts of the body where it's also very important. But in the GI tract itself, you'll see that it's an adherent, helping food particles stick together so that we have a fecal bulk that's created, which is, if you think about bulk forming laxatives, those are things that are taken to make a large bulk to force diarrhea. So when you think about somebody having a high fiber diet versus a low fiber diet, that has to do with the amount of fecal bulk and then how much work the small intestine has to do and the large intestine. Generally, the lower the amount of fiber somebody has in the diet, the harder their GI tract has to contract, meaning it's more likely that they have damage to the colon, specifically diverticulitis in the sigmoid area. It has sufficient body, meaning that it has enough surface tension to stick to the walls of every place in the gut so that the food or any of the various iterations of food as it traverses through the tract don't actually come into contact with the walls of the tract itself. So mucus just creates a nice lubricant for the tube so that it protects it. Low resistance for slippage, so particles slide along very easily. Low resistance means if you're putting up resistance, like if you're resisting arrest, you're making it difficult for that thing to happen. So if there's low resistance, things can slip along pretty easily and move from point A to point B. I mentioned fecal adherence. A large part of the stool is mucus. So it helps stool to stay together. When there is a high amount of mucus in the stool, that usually means that things were moving quickly and the body made more mucus to hurry along the transit through the GI tract. Mucus is also resistant to gastrointestinal enzymes, meaning that it can stay in place and protect those walls of the organ, and it also won't be broken down by any of those catalytic enzymes. Finally, it's amphoteric, meaning it can buffer both acids and alkalis so that it can neutralize and make adequate the pH of the product in each area so that it can have the maximal amount of absorption. And before we get into the products, I want to bring up a couple of types of glands that you'll see making different products or mucus or both. Starting out with goblet cells, which are a very prevalent type of cell in the entire body. You see them in the lungs, you see them in the GI tract, and goblet cells are named goblet cells. You see one in this top picture here because they look like drinking goblets underneath a microscope. Wherever you see goblet cells, you will see cilia generally, or you just see a whole lot of mucus. It's goblet cells' job to make mucus, and they respond to local irritation, meaning they make more mucus when there's an irritant. That's what's responsible for you making more mucus and having to cough and blow your nose more when you're sick. Goblet cells kick up their production of mucus to help form a thicker barrier so that pathogens don't enter the body. It makes a mucus that lubricates and protects epithelial surfaces, so it's a nice good mucus for slippage so that things move in a nice lubricated environment. Other type of glands that you'll see besides just goblet cells, or we call them mucus cells sometimes too because that's all they make, there are gastric pits. And when you look inside the stomach, looks like there's tiny dots that are in the wall. And those dots essentially lead down to invaginations we call gastric pits. And it's important that they're way down here in the submucosal area because part of these cells will be making their own protective mucus. They're called mucus neck cells right up here at the top of the pit. So that means everything below that area, this neck area, these are all active cells along these pits lying in the submucosa, and all of those different colors are referring to a different type of cell. So there's different cells making acid in here, different enzymes, and local hormones as well. So secretory means secreted into, which could be into the bloodstream in some cases. And these, like the hormonal cells, like gastrin cells are down here. Those will traverse into the bloodstream to act on nerves and muscles in that area of the body. But you'll find the pits in the stomach. You won't see these everywhere. Those are specialized stomach glands. Other types of glands that we'll see, there are tubular glands, which are just a general name for cells, again, that are down in a tube. You'll find these in the stomach and the duodenum. So gastric pits are kind of like a type of tubular cells, but a little bit different. We'll go through that in a bit, but they're just one tube rather than more intricate secretory cells. You'll see mainly excretory cells in those areas. To remember, to excrete means to expel, and the GI tract is technically exterior to the body. So you'll see some things being secreted in a tubular way, where things that are secretory, they're made and put into the bloodstream. So excrete is outside, secrete is into the blood, or the submucosal areas in this case, where you'll get diffusion into the bloodstream. There's also more complex exocrine glands. So you've probably heard endocrine. Endocrine means things made inside of the body that are delivered to the inside, like to the bloodstream. When they're complex, it means that there's many different transporters and there's different pieces associated with this. This includes salivary glands, liver cells that form complicated glands once they get below the canaliculi. There's pancreatic glands that make exocrine products. Those are different than their endocrine products like insulin and glucagon. Endocrine goes into the bloodstream. Exocrine goes into the exterior of the body. They can be through a duct. That kind of makes an exocrine gland. It has to go through a duct. So these lie outside the walls of the GI tract. So here's an example of a salivary gland. These little balls here, we call them acinar cells, and you'll see acinar or acini for a single one in one area, and those cells get together and they make a product that's then excreted into the lumen of a duct, and then those things will leave that duct and be excreted out to the body. Okay, so we said the stimulus for secretion can be just general contact or stretch, like you'll see in a lot of areas. We saw that mostly with muscular activity. When there's stretch in an area, then there's a stimulus for motility. Here, when there's mechanical presence of food, you get secretion in that area, and if something touches a glandular cell, then generally that cell becomes active. There's also local epithelial stimulation, which activates the enteric nervous system, so the gut brain we've been talking about. So that could be tactile stimulation, which just means touch. Tactile's touch. Chemical irritation, so something damaging in some cases, or something that's old, a pathogen gets into your body. There's a huge amount of secretion to try to rush that product out. And then finally, just distension of the wall, so just stretch of the wall. All of these things eventually stimulate the mucus glands and the deep glands, which work together with the enteric nervous system, kind of overriding the entire system until all the products are eventually excreted from the body. We've already mentioned also that the parasympathetic nervous system has the most innervation for excitatory activity with all parts of the GI tract. That's why we call it the rest and digest system. It's very into digesting products. Whenever the parasympathetic nervous system is activated, that could be through the vagus, the glossopharyngeal, the trigeminal, that has a large activation in the salivary glands, esophageal glands, gastric glands, pancreas, Brunner's glands, and it also innervates the distal colon. So remember, if it's PNS, it's either cranial nerves coming out to innervate a ganglia in the tissue, or it's sacral nerves, S2, 3, 4, that then take their pelvic pathways and innervate places like the distal colon, right below the sigmoid. When the sympathetic system is secreted, or activated, sorry, not secreted, it's when it's stimulated, there's a small increase in secretion, but mainly you'll get vasoconstriction to limit blood flow to GI areas, which will limit the amount of activity those muscles can engage in, because muscles need oxygen to work. So if you have a vasoconstrictor in that area, it decreases blood flow, which carries oxygen, which will limit the activity of that area. If there is SNS stimulation alone, there's just a slight increase in secretion. If there's already hormonal stimulation going, you'll get reduced secretion. Meaning that if you are in parasympathetic outflow and just your hang out, rest, and digest, and the SNS becomes stimulated, then there's going to be reduced secretory activity. If the SNS alone is stimulated, yeah, there's a little bit of increase, and that's mostly in this area in the colon to help with that peristaltic rush. You do see diarrhea with stimulation, especially really strong stimulant drugs. Okay, so these secretory products can either be excretory, meaning they're going to be products of digestion, and then there are our hormonal products, so those are secretory. Oh no, Alexa thought I was talking to her. Oh man. Hang on, I don't even know what this song is. Alexa, stop. Just going rogue, guys. All right, well, there's a lot of different hormones, and I'm not going to read all these to you because you can read that yourself, but the main point of hormones is that they're made in a gland or by a glandular cell, and they're put into the bloodstream. So I'm going to just talk to you about a couple of them that are important. All of the ones on here, this is a great one to study right away. These are some specialized ones, but I will hit on them for a little bit. Okay, most important, we've got CCK, cholecysto or cystokinin. Whenever you see cola, that's referring to the gallbladder. So whenever CCK is released and goes into the bloodstream, the gallbladder will contract. And that's important because the gallbladder stores bile. The gallbladder is also connected to the common bile duct from the liver. So, and then you have the pancreas on the other side, which then connects also with those ducts together. It's controlled by the sphincter of Oddi, so that when you have an opening of the sphincter of Oddi, when it's activated, you will have the release of pancreatic products and anything that's stored in the common bile duct, which should be, bile. So CCK induces the gallbladder to contract and expel its contents of bile into the duct, into the common bile duct. That will raise the pressure in that area and allow that lumen to open. So you'll have secretion of pancreatic hormones and bile. So CCK is going to be important in stimulating contraction of the gallbladder. And it's also going to be an important kind of stop mechanism, because remember, once things make its way into the duodenum and small intestine, eventually we need to inhibit what the stomach is doing. We don't need any more acid if there's no food left in the stomach. So CCK will be important in inhibitory control as well. Then there's secretin. That is a pancreatic exocrine secretion, so that is made by acinar cells in the pancreas, and it's excreted into a duct, and that will also be involved in that gastroileal reflex to inhibit the activity of the gastric acid secretion. GIP is a local hormone that goes over or has control over incretin activity. We'll go over the incretin hormones in a second. Motilin is named that because it is a general motility activator. Excuse me. Ghrelin is one of my favorite words to say. Ghrelin is something that's released by these local cells in the stomach, and I like to say it ghrelin because it's associated with things like hunger pains or hunger pangs when the stomach growls, and it lets you know that you're hungry. So when the stomach's been empty and you start to get the message to your brain that you should eat something, that's ghrelin. We see that gastrin in itself is going to be the main excitatory local hormone of gastric activity. Not only does it increase muscular contraction, but it also increases all secretory activity in the stomach, most importantly acid secretion. And there's a pathway with that we'll look at. All right, then we've got hormonal products coming from the pancreas. So the pancreas is interesting. It's both an endocrine and an exocrine hormone. Organ. It makes endocrine products that go into the bloodstream, insulin and glucagon, which help regulate glucose activity in the bloodstream. Those are activated only by high or low levels of glucose in the blood. So we call that glycemia, glucose levels in the blood. PIP is pancreatic polypeptide, and that is going to be very important with gastric motility and satiation. PIP is released typically around the same time as CCK to help, again, inhibit gastric motility. Amylin, whenever you see amylin, that is going to be associated with carbohydrate breakdown. So you have salivary amylase. So amylase is an enzyme that breaks down hormones. Amylin is a local hormone that is activated when there's high carbohydrate sugar intake. All right, then we've got our specialized ones. GLP is named GLP because it was found in the Gila monster, and that starts with a G. GLP-1 is made by cells in the duodenum whenever there's food in there. And GLP slows gastric emptying, and it encourages insulin release. So it regulates glycemia, and it helps to slow generally stomach emptying so that you feel full longer, and it helps shuttle glucose from the bloodstream into the tissues that can utilize it. What we've also found, and I wrote a paper on it maybe a year or two ago, is that the GLP system, it also can bind to receptors in the reward center of your brain. So it actually has a large interplay with eating to satiety, meaning whether or not you're full. And if you highly activate this system, the GLP system, you'll see that people and animals, they start shifting their food intake from what we call hedonic, or eating because it tastes good and you're not necessarily hungry, or very high caloric foods, to more homeostatic feeding. And a lot of the diabetic drugs that you inject, like liraglutide is one, they affect GLP-1. So it lets it stay around longer so that people feel fuller longer. And it works not only to really regulate blood sugar, but what you see is those patients lose a lot of weight and they become very fit. And they don't engage in extra activity. They just report that they don't necessarily want the highly caloric foods that they used to like. So it physically shifts preference by blunting the reward that comes from food. So that's kind of interesting to me. The other ones we're not going to talk about because they're quite specialized, but GLP-1, you should know a little bit about it because that's kind of cool, and there's a lot of data on it. And if you do have patients that have diabetes, they have a pretty large, especially if it's type 2, probability of being on a drug that's going to affect GLP-1. Okay. So glandular cells are cells that are going to have products that are absorbed from the bloodstream. So let's say that we're in the duodenum right now. Those products from the breakdown of the food product will come into the bloodstream because that's the way absorption works, right? We go from high to low concentration of a product. It can be from the duodenum, where there'd be a high amount of nutrients, into the bloodstream where there'd be a low amount of nutrients. So just simple high to low transit. So those products in the blood, those are picked up by different nerves that are attached to chemoreceptors, tactile receptors, irritant receptors, and they convey that information about what's in that product so that they can activate the inner cell activity of active glandular cells. And these cells have the same parts as all other cells. The only difference is that they're activated when there's a specific product. And that information will tell the cell what it needs to start secreting in most cases, or whether or not it needs to do that. If there are no proteins in that food, then we won't have activation if it's a cell that makes trypsin. But we will need some other product in that time. So when there's these products breaking down, it will convey that information to turn on the production of a product. Like in all cells, the mitochondria are there to generate ATP so that there's an oxidative energy capacity to the cell and it can turn on. And then the endoplasmic reticulum has its ribosomes on its surface, and those ribosomes will start configuring proteins, like these large hormones. They're large polypeptide proteins. So those hormones will be stored in this area, the ER, for a little bit of time, and then they can be brought to the Golgi for further storage in some cases, or they can be altered with the addition or subtraction of certain products, and then packaged into vesicles which bud off of the Golgi. And then those vesicles will be driven to eventually dock and bind to the apical side of this secretory cell, and then through exocytosis will secrete their products into the body or into the bloodstream. So these are what glandular cells look like. They're associated with the blood, and they release their products when there's a message about what is traveling within them. All right, so that was my little review about all of the different pieces, and in just a second, we'll get into the specialized products in each area. Okay,